Hey guys, how's it going? This is Natinator. My first job was at a 24-hour restaurant called Flavies on 3rd and Burlington in Westlake. It was a real hole-in-the-wall place, the type where patrons line up beneath the menu board, specializing in burgers, gyros, and all-day grease-heavy breakfast. I worked graveyard shifts. So did most of my customers. The medical crowd. There were 2 middle-sized hospitals nearby. Cops, firefighters, and the assorted civil servants that filtered in and out of the neighborhood. A middle-aged LAPD officer used to come by, sometimes with a partner, sometimes alone. Let's call him Officer Carlos Nunez. Officer Nunez didn't look like a cop. If I'd seen him at the grocery store, I'd have thought he were a professor or an attorney or a realtor. He had a square jaw and a high forehead, curly brown hair, an endearing bald spot, and the friendly, diplomatic face of a sitcom dad. Officer Nunez had stories. On lazy nights, he could entertain his audience for hours. That audience, consisting of eagle, scout-looking fire babies, bored security guards, and nursing students off clinical shifts. 30 years with a badge and a car had given him plenty of material. When there were no kiddies to impress, he talked to me. Some of his stories were pretty dark. He saved those stories for the coldest, windiest nights when Flavies was empty, save for him and me and the cooks. Though it was nearly a decade ago, what he told me on one of those nights still lingers in the back of my mind. There's a building, he'd started, less than a mile from here, near 6th and Alvarado. It was abandoned, repossessed by the bank. They should have bulldozed the dump. It had been low-income housing, the Primrose Apartments. Originally office space, the building was bought at auction in 1999, gutted, and divided into cheap, little white-walled units where the roofs leaked and the air conditioning never worked. In the early 2000s, Nunez was dispatched to the Primrose every couple weeks, for the reasons one would expect. Domestic disturbances, possession with intent to sell, drunken brawls in the parking lot, solicitation, truancy, noise complaints. Nothing out of the ordinary for a public housing complex lodged within the bowels of a major city. Yet somehow, embarrassingly, the building played on his nerves. I never liked the place, he told me. It was creepy. No building erected in the 70s has the right to be as creepy as that one. If he'd been asked to put a finger on the epicenter of this innate creepiness, he'd have pointed to a little closet on the 1st floor. The way he described it was, coming from the back entrance, which only employees and cops ever used, a left turn would take you to a set of double doors, through which the elevator lobby and the leasing office were accessible. A right turn led down a narrow hallway, past the janitor's storage, to a dead end. The little closet in question was opposite the janitor's. The door was unlabeled, innocuous, and should have functioned as a glorified wallpaper. But for Nunez, who'd stumbled upon the closet while looking for a restroom, even a glance toward it filled him with irrational dread. A funny smell lingered about the door. He'd catch a faint tendril of the stench every time he walked through the back door. One night, Nunez and his partner, a lady cop who went by Rusty, were dispatched to the Primrose to investigate a domestic disturbance. A man threatening his girlfriend with a butcher knife. They found the woman locked in the bathroom and the boyfriend pounding on the door. Let's call the woman Marisol and the man Modesto. Nunez and Rusty managed to cajole the pair into cooperating. Rusty stayed in the woman with Marisol. Nunez sat in the kitchen with Modesto. Modesto claimed that Marisol was cheating on him with her ex-husband. He'd seen the ex hanging around the elevator lobby. When quizzed on the subject, Marisol insisted Modesto was crazy. Yes, she was still friendly with her ex-husband, but it was solely for the sake of their son. She had no desire to sleep with him, and besides, the ex-husband lived in Washington. It was suggested that Modesto had seen a man who resembled Marisol's ex. He got defensive. He strode into Marisol's son's room and came out with a framed picture. The son, with his arm around a taller, better-looking man. "I gotta see this shit every day," he ranted to Nunez. "You don't think I'd recognize this arsehole if I saw him?" It took a while, but Modesto calmed down and admitted he may have been mistaken. Marisol didn't want to press charges, and the couple was left in peace. 2 weeks later, Nunez and Rusty were called to the same apartment for the same reason. This time, Marisol was barricaded in the master bedroom, and Modesto was brandishing a tire iron, insisting he'd had an enraging conversation with her ex-husband in the lobby. "You fucked him," he screamed. "He told me. He said you fucked him on our fucking bed." Backup was called. 30 minutes later, Modesto was cuffed, sobbing, to a chair, while Marisol tearfully paced on the phone with the ex-husband, trying to prove he hadn't been hanging out in the lobby of the Primrose. "There!" she cried finally. Triumphantly, she'd pulled up a picture on her phone and shoved it in Modesto's face. She handed the phone to Nunez. It was of the man from the picture, her ex-husband, standing by a City of Wenatchee street sign, holding a copy of The Wenatchee World with the day's date. "No way he flew here, fucked me, then flew back to Washington in time to take this picture." Modesto was asked to elaborate. Maybe he was the butt end of a cruel trick. He said he'd been alone in the elevator lobby, checking his mail. The ex-husband stealthily came up beside him and had described, in graphic, excruciating detail, what he and Marisol had done while Modesto was at work. This time, Modesto was more difficult to pacify. He'd been suspicious for months, he told the cops. He knew the ex-husband had attempted to reconcile with Marisol. He was uncomfortable with their amicable relationship, and it didn't help that Marisol used her ex to stoke Modesto's jealousy. She'd call him whenever the two of them got into a fight, and constantly talked about how good a father and provider he was. Finally, they came to a resolution. Modesto went to stay with his brother. Marisol agreed to lock the doors, and a police car was dispatched to the neighborhood in case the ex-husband reappeared or Modesto got cute. Nunez didn't know what to make of the two of them. Modesto was obviously paranoid, but his fury and grief had been sincere. Marisol may have used her ex-husband to make her current beau jealous, but she'd seemed legitimately mystified by his accusations of infidelity. And Nunez highly doubted the ex-husband would have hopped on a plane to Los Angeles just to fuck his ex-wife and stick it to her new boyfriend. And then there was the man in the elevator lobby. The man who might have been in the elevator lobby. Nunez and Rusty passed him on the way back to their squad car. A man, leaning against the wall, face buried in a newspaper. Nunez saw the man and registered what he was seeing, but it took his subconscious a minute to process the information. Then, realization of what he'd seen, and its implications, hit him like a ton of bricks, and he'd ran, back through the back entrance, back through the double doors. But the man was gone, and Nunez was left to wonder whether or not it had all been his imagination. Because he could swear the man had been reading a copy of the Wenatchee World. Next, Nunez detailed an incident involving a middle-aged Bible thumper he called Dolores. Dolores lived on the second floor of the Primrose Apartments. She was a sweet lady, but painfully high-strung. At least once a week, the cops were summoned to her humble abode. She heard a noise after midnight? Call the cops. Two suspicious-looking men talking in the parking lot? Call the cops. Her son's out 5 minutes past curfew? Call the cops. It had gotten to the point where the dispatchers recognized her voice. Nunez had been sent to calm her down more than once. He believed that truly, Dolores just needed someone to talk to, and she talked a lot. She talked about her blackout drunk past, about her husband who had fled in the dead of the night with a shoebox full of cash she'd been saving for her kids to go to college, never to be seen or heard from again. She told him about how she'd found Jesus and how she wished her meth-addicted daughter would come home. The daughter had been in Bakersfield last she'd heard, shacking up with the boyfriend du jour, and 3 months pregnant. But that had been 2 years ago, and now her number was disconnected and her mail got sent back, and all Dolores could do was pray for her grandchild. She talked about her son, Michael. He was 17 and a senior in high school. Michael was a good boy, she insisted, but she didn't like his friends. They were a bad influence on him, and lately, he'd been avoiding her calls and coming home late. He was surlier, angrier, and his clothes smelled like marijuana. He swore the pot smell had come from his friend's car, but Dolores was scared. She thought he was doing drugs. "I can't lose him," she'd sobbed to Nunez, as he tried to convince her that the car stalling in the parking lot wasn't indicative of a drug deal. Mikey is all I have left." One September day, Nunez and Rusty were, yet again, dispatched to Dolores' apartment. He was more frustrated than concerned. They'd had a rough morning, and he wasn't in the mood to take notes on the explosion. Read, upstairs neighbor dropped a pot and lid, Dolores had heard, or nod and through one of her long-winded tales of motherly woe. But, according to the dispatcher, this time was different. Dolores, who usually took an assertive and condescending tone, had been screaming and crying. It was her son. He was hurt. The paramedics were 15 minutes away. Dolores answered the door howling. Her prematurely wrinkled face was streaked with tears. Her eyes were bloodshot. Her hair stuck out where she'd pulled at it, and she was sobbing so violently she could barely speak. "Michael?" she panted, pointing toward a closed door. "Michael, he's... She screamed, primal, animalistic. She cried out to the sky and collapsed on the floor, burying her tear-stained face in her knees. Even thinking about it, Nunez told me, was enough to make him tear up. All the pain and despair in the world was captured in that scream.